Hi folks, Mayfield here, and welcome to Scholar Tarot. Thanks a ton for joining me at my study space. Today we're going to be taking a look at an old hashtag all the way back from October 2020. It is the hashtag Tarot Collector by Brant from Moonbaby. So I'll make sure I link all the appropriate sources at the bottom, and we'll also have the prompts at the bottom so you can follow along, as well as embedded within this video too. And this is actually the first hashtag that I ever watched on YouTube. I didn't even know that there are video responses to several different hashtags. I thought video responses in general were just a very early 2010s kind of thing. So it was honestly just a pleasure to see everyone just sharing their collections using this really fun collection of prompts in order to do that, because it's I mean, easy but time consuming to just go through a bunch of tarot decks, especially if you have an enormous collection. But to have it as concentrated as following along specific categories, like I think that is like significantly more fun and more interactive than just plopping down a pile of your own collection. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So for the first prompt is your most expensive deck. Now this one was a little hard to sift through because I did need to go back to my inventory list and see what the heck I spent on what. And I ended up landing on the Storm Roots Oracle by the Hurricane Mystic, and I'll show that to you right now. I specifically remember this deck being like 90 Canada bucks, but I live in the US, and so that's gotta come out to what, like around 80 bucks at the time. And this deck, what I thought was kind of cool is that I first found out about this deck from Havana from Sparkle Divine Tarot. She had the first edition, which I thought was really pretty, and she did say that there was going to be like a reprint according to the artist, the Hurricane Mystic. And so I went to go check, and lo and behold, it is the Typhoon edition. It's pretty hard for me to figure out, like, hey, is this deck something that I want in my collection? And during that time, I think that's when I started my low by depth year, so I was being really selective about what I put into my collection. And one of the criteria that I picked was whatchamacallit, it has to be financially viable. So if it's gonna be like a pre-order that I'm doing, then it better come with like some extras, right? And for this, it was pretty easy for me to say yes to it because, I mean, I wanted to support like an independent artist, of course. And it did actually come with a couple of dice. I would show them to you, but I used them for D&D, and they're just in a bag full of D&D dice, so I'm not going to sift through them. But it came with like a bunch of dice, or a couple of dice, and it also has like you can see the titles of each of the cards, as well as like a short description, which I thought was really nice for me to go ahead and do like a lazy reading if I ever wanted to do that. I do wish that the cards were a little bit bigger. I believe these are smaller than the original edition. And that's honestly really it. I was surprised to see that there were a couple of sentences on the cards themselves, because the guidebook is actually pretty extensive about what it wants to have, about the information that it has. So, I mean, that's not much of a critique per se, as it is just an observation. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. But yes, the Storm Roots Oracle. Oh, and check this out. It is, look how blinding and awesome that is. So yes, this is the Storm Roots Oracle by the Hurricane Mystic. Okay, and then the second prompt is my least expensive deck, and that's gonna be the Zombie Tarot. Out of the several video responses to these prompts that I've seen, I feel like I've seen the Zombie Oracle in like a good chunk of them, because it is kind of a really cheap deck. and I do have it in order because I do have a video essay planned for it, so I won't give too much away. But this deck is $16.95 in US dollars. At the time that I purchased this, I worked for Barnes & Noble, which is a bookstore, and you get a pretty sweet discount. I think now the employee discounts run like 40% off, but when I had started, it was like 30% off, and it was pretty fantastic. So whatever 30% off $16.95 is, I think it's like 11 or 12 bucks. That is what I paid for this deck. And I won't get into too much detail because I do want to talk more about this deck in another video. But for our purposes, my least expensive deck is the Zombie Tarot. And we're on to prompt number 3. Something in my collection that other collectors would want to steal. And that would be the Yokai-Yochi Tarot from Bubo Plague. I'm gonna go ahead and flip through a couple of the cards, and I'm not even gonna say why people would want to steal this deck. Shortly after I received... You know what? No, that's not true. Shortly before I received it, there were already like ISO posts, in search of posts on like the Facebook marketplace. And the whole reason I even backed this deck was because I'm like, ooh, pretty. And you know, of course I always want to support independent artists before I like go mass market. But this deck, unfortunately, a reprint is up in the air, but I absolutely recommend you check out some of the other stuff that the artist Bubo Plague has, because I've seen like they have like really cute pins and stuff like that, and I might have to go back for more. But yes, this is the deck that most collectors would want to steal from my collection. Prompt number 5 is my most strangest deck, and I'm gonna give it to the Tarot of Shadows. Now, full disclosure, I purchased this deck during my edgy phase of collecting. I don't know if anyone ever has like an edgy phase of collecting tarot decks where they're like, I'm gonna be an expert in like dark decks or some cringy stuff like that. And when I received this deck, it definitely threw me for a loop a little bit because, I mean, first of all, it doesn't necessarily have like the traditional tarot system. Like there is definitely a major arcana, but not much of a concentrated minor arcana. And right now I think you're taking a look at you're looking at the words are hard. You're looking at the major arcana, because I think the guidebook actually recommends that you work with the major arcana separately than the minor arcana, which is just very bizarre to me, but you know, I'm not mad at it. You basically use one as like a significator, and then you use like the rest of the cards for like further context or details. But otherwise, like the art is really pretty. I think when I worked with this deck a little bit more intimately, based on how the guidebook reads, it feels like a Christian theologian really wanted to like make some sort of flashcard system for like biblical figures and biblical myths and other biblical stuffs, and accidentally made a satanic deck. So that's what this is essentially, and that's why I also call it my strangest deck in my collection, the Tarot of Shadows. Prompt number 5 is a deck that's least likely in others' collection, and I'm gonna give that one to... Oops, sorry, I'm breaking stuff. I'm gonna give that to this one. This is the Tarocchi de Robot, and I hope you can see that okay, because it's just completely silver. This deck is kind of old. I think it's about 50 years old. What is it, 2022 right now? Yeah, it's like, it's roughly 50 years old. This is my old man. And the only reason why I'm guessing that this deck is probably not in anyone else's collection, or not very many people's collection, not only because of the age factor, but I have never once seen any walkthrough of this deck. When I was originally starting my tarot collecting, I really wanted a tarot deck that included robots in it, because I just really like robots, and I did a lot of my academic work with technology and all that good stuff. And so in my search for a more cybernetic tarot or robot tarot, I did come by this one, but it was out of print. Any listings on eBay or anything like that would be quite a few $100s, and even in searching for what these cards look like, I couldn't find it anywhere on YouTube. And I mean, that might have changed since the last I checked, which was easily like a few years ago. But I eventually had to take the plunge, and thankfully the buyer that I purchased from on eBay, they really had a lot of love for this deck, and this was absolutely a secondhand deck, and luckily I didn't have to pay too much for it. So yes, this is going to be the deck that I don't think is in very many people's collections. It's the Tarocchi de Robot. Alrighty, and since the Tarocchi de Robot was easily like my oldest deck, being at about 50 years old, I'm gonna go ahead and opt for the deck that has been the longest in my collection for prompt, what is it? Prompt 6. Because you can interchange it. It can either be like the oldest deck or the deck you've had in your collection the longest. And for me, that's gonna be the Beautiful Creatures. Hopefully that's not too big. Yay, we're good. Okay, so this is the first edition. This was actually gifted to me by a former coworker when I worked at my local coffee shop. Local, please, it was a Starbucks. Okay. And I actually still get a lot of play out of this deck. The only trouble that I had when I first had this deck, like I was really excited and super grateful that I had this like at hand, but the problem is it's not like all that traditional, because as you can see here, they follow like the zodiacs, which is something that I do not do. And so having to learn tarot in general from this tarot deck that doesn't really show you which court card is which, unless you had the guidebook, which thankfully I do, that really confused me quite a bit once I started getting into other tarot decks. And so that was really unfortunate at the time, because even to this day, I still struggle with court cards. I'm not blaming anyone, but I get a sneaking feeling that that my early education in tarot was maybe stifled a bit by having these non-traditional cards, with the exception of the court cards, I guess, or excuse me, the minor arcana. But yes, this deck has been in my collection for, I'm gonna say it had to have been like 4 years ago is when I started, when I expressed any interest in tarot, and one of my coworkers really took that to heart, and she gave me one of something from her collection. Prompt number 7 is my newest deck. So the deck that just came into my collection literally a few days ago was the Wandering Moon Tarot. This was one of the last decks that I purchased before I started this this incredibly low buy depth here. And I was really fighting myself on whether or not I wanted it, but I decided to sort of take the plunge, especially since this is what's called a seconds copy. So sometimes what what especially indie artists will do when they have a bunch of their tarot decks that they're trying to sell. They will have like a separate listing for like any imperfect copies, and this one, I mean, it's just super small, like just the corners were a little dinged up, but it's really not a big deal, and the cards are perfectly fine. But yes, it was uncertain if I actually wanted this in my collection because I had something kind of similar to it, and that something was the Tongues of the Mother by Lolu, which I'll have to show in another video. But I decided that, you know, I may as well try it out, especially since it was pretty affordable at the time. And yeah, I've been working with it ever since, and it's a very intuitive read. It goes particularly well with Visions of the Liminal Space by Everyday Magic, which maybe I'll show at a certain point too. But yes, this is my newest deck that's entered my collection, and I'm glad I took the plunge. Which tarot deck made you want to collect in the first place? And if you watch through to the end of my tarot book report video, you know it. Maybe you'll love it, or maybe not. I'm still actually kind of salty about it. The Hexen 2.0. And again, this is cheating because I technically do not own the deck. And this was also just a lesson in this was the first time basically that I learned that a tarot deck can go out of print. And so I was really heartbroken about it. And at the time I had just started working at Barnes & Noble, and I'm thinking in my head, it's like, well, if I can't have this deck, then I guess I'll have to just purchase some of the other decks that are on the shelves. So that way I don't have to miss out. So yes, this was also a first lesson in the fear of missing out. And, you know, I've just had to be okay with not having everything, but it definitely kickstarted that feeling of, I want to have a library of this thing, of like this kind of product. I want a ton of tarot decks that I can look at, that I can read with, that maybe I can show others, etc., etc., and ones that can just stimulate that academic part of me. Because as I said in that previous video, there are a few tarot decks that inspired me to look at tarot through an academic lens, that being at the time, you know, Dust to Onyx, as I mentioned in that video. But also, these are full texts and I want to read as many as I possibly can that interest me as much as they do. So yes, this is the tarot deck that inspired me to begin a tarot collection. Here is prompt number 9, and that's going to be my favorite tarot deck. So that deck is definitely a form of cartomancy, but it's not a tarot deck. This is the Black Gold Lenormand by T and Ian from Grandma Baby, okay, this is a word that I struggle with, Apothecary? Black Gold Lenormand by Grandma Babies, that's what it's called. And this deck, I kickstarted this deck shortly before summer of 2020. And I'd never read with Lenormand before, but this was going to be my first Lenormand deck, so I figured, like, yeah, totally. And this deck is just absolutely breathtaking to look at. Anytime I play with it, I touch it, I read with it. It's actually been a little bit of a while since I've read with it. However, on my study space, I usually cycle out through a few decks, depending on the season or depending on how I'm feeling. But this deck always stays on this desk. And what I really love about it is just not only the resourcefulness of it in using public domain images and, you know, lacing them with gold, but just this deck just lies right on that boundary between the sacred and the mundane, and it is like a historical artifact. I feel like it's even cited at the bottom here, and it's just such an intimate reader for me personally. Me being a woman of color, like this person could easily be like an ancestor of mine. Not even an ancestor, like he could have easily been like my grandfather. And so it's just a very powerful experience whenever I pick this deck up, regardless of how mundanely I use it, if that's even a word. But yes, this is my favorite deck. This is the Black Gold Lenormand by T and Ian. And there you have it. That is the hashtag Tarot Collector by Brant from Moonbaby. If you want to try this out, highly recommend. It's a fun little exercise, especially when you have like a bunch of tarot decks that you don't even know what to do with, or that of course you know what to do with, but you know, you're not really sure what else you want to do with it. A couple of videos that I've seen, or excuse me, a couple of video responses that I've seen that I really love watching, that I'll send you to, would be the video response from Oya's Girl. That video is kind of long. It's about like an hour or so, but oh my god, her collection is fascinating. She has like a couple of entries like in each of those categories, and her collection just blew my mind. It is so vastly different than anything else that I've ever seen. And then another one would probably be the video response from Hermit's Cave. That one is a lot of fun too. But if you want to check out the original and see 9 different variations of the Rider-Waite deck, you can check out Brant at Moonbaby, which I'll link all of that stuff below in the description. At any rate, thank you so much for joining us today in today's hashtag. Hope to catch you next time in another video. But in the meantime, stay safe out there, and remember to make discourse, not war. Bye!